Greetings and felicitations.
Hip hip hurrah, tally ho.
Hey, Cutie Pie.
Hey, Puddin'.
All right, we're excited. We're going to go through our rewatch of Star Trek Enterprise, episode by episode, and discuss it.
All right, so it's a show that we were kind of ho-hum about when it was first on, but now we seem to like it a lot more.
We sure do. I mean, my first reaction when I first saw it, I've watched every initial episode of Star Trek since Next Generation. So from Next Generation up, I've caught it from the beginning. And
yes,
you're
me
the
too.
same way, right?
Exactly, yeah.
So my initial reaction was I didn't care for it. I didn't like the look. I didn't like the feel. I didn't like the pace. I mean, I begrudgingly kept watching it until I fizzled out and just gave up. What was your experience initially? Back in 2001.
I just thought it was okay. It didn't look that bad, but it just didn't seem up to par with the other Star Trek shows that came before it.
But now we're looking at it through a whole different lens. I think this is the type of show that once you go all the way through it, rewatching it, it makes much more sense. Do you agree?
Yes, and obviously it's one that holds up through the years because we're watching it now 20 years later.
And it looks great. It really does. And now that we've been accustomed to some of the retconning in there, it's not as jarring. Because initially, we're big Star Trek expanded universe fans, the comic books, the novels, and so right off the bat, seeing a prequel with a Klingon that looks like a TNG Klingon, like, I didn't go for that at all initially.
No, it just looked wrong when you're first looking at it. And yes, they do explain the Klingons later on, but they wouldn't have needed the full explanation if they had started with the TOS Klingons that we know from the timeline.
And that was just one of the hang-ups that I had, but over time, the show makes more sense out of it, and some things I've just learned to overlook because the stories and the characters really are compelling. So let's talk about the details. One of the things that's unique about this show is it came on, I mean, almost immediately after Voyager ended. The producers were in fast-forward mode of, we have to have Star Trek on television. This is the first Star Trek of the new century.
It was, and it came on right after 9/11, so it was kind of, people were kind of in that melancholy, depressed mood. But it had started production before 9/11, so it was supposed to be more optimistic.
Rick Berman, Brandon Braga production, prequel of Star Trek. Now, of Star Trek, the original series, I should say. Now, I've heard it so many times that they toss around this idea because in 1999, what other franchise started their prequel series?
Star Wars.
It was a huge hit.
So of course, yeah, so Star Trek had to try it. They had this idea. And because so many Star Trek shows had been done and they were trying to find a new angle for it.
So anytime you have a prequel, the concern is always going to be, are they going to screw up canon? Are they going to add to things that we're not exactly comfortable with? I mean, anytime you do a prequel, you're curious about it to a degree, but then you're a little bit afraid as well. Look, as a Star Wars fan, I walked out of The Phantom Menace and I just said, wow, the special effects were great. And that's all I could compliment on it.
Yeah, with Enterprise, I mean, I was leery when I found out it was going to be a prequel because, I mean, I didn't want to do that, and I knew that it would be really hard to stay within canon to do that. I was also leery hearing about Discovery, that it was going to be another prequel too. So yeah, it's like, so Enterprise already started off like with this idea that we weren't really behind 100%.
We're going to need to begin this discussion by looking at the TV guide from July. It's the issue that handles the weeks between 14th and 20th, 2001. And this is the first full article that TV Guide related to the new Star Trek Enterprise series. And it's entitled Back to the Future. It's an interview with Rick Berman.
He's the one that took over the reins of Star Trek from Gene Roddenberry, and he's the co-creator of this show, Enterprise. And he did all the other Star Trek spin-offs.
Yes, and for Star Trek collectors and TV Guide collectors, this is, I think, one of the better issues because it talks directly to Rick about not only the immediate plans for the show, but the future plans for the show, and it kind of braced everyone for the big differences between the entire franchise. It goes on by asking, it said that Enterprise is different from all previous Trek series, but how different is it?
Well, of course, because this one is a prequel. It's the first time Star Trek tried to do something set before the original series.
And he mentions that, and he said that Gene Roddenberry created the show in the 22nd century, or I should say the 23rd century. It spun off into the 24th century, and there was a point that he felt that the ships got faster and the species were creepier, but it didn't go where no man has gone before. So he felt pulling it back a little bit, grounding it in the 22nd century, we would get to see what exploration was truly like.
That was a good idea because, you know, after Gene created The Next Generation, then you have like Deep Space Nine, well, you know, which was, it had some exploration but not as much, and then Voyager, they were exploring, but they were in a place where they didn't want to be, and same with Deep Space Nine. So with Enterprise, as he was saying, you've got characters that are excited about exploring because it's humanity's first time going that deep into space.
Yes. Makes it a point that it doesn't say USS Enterprise, but instead NX-01 Enterprise, and that's because there's no Federation yet.
So there is a Starfleet in this one, but it's not, but they don't have the United Federation of Planets yet. So the Enterprise is part of Starfleet. You still have the officers and the ranking captain. So there's some things that are similar.
I like the fact that they said that they spent some time on an actual submarine to get a feel of what it's like living on a submarine in reference to the design of the interior of this ship.
I am so glad they did their research, and I think it did help. I think they did create that look very well, being in this cramped area, and it's very gray, the gray backgrounds, and having the cramped quarters and the low ceilings, and having all the gears in the background.
And it also mentions they tried to make the series, the characters, a bit more contemporary, not as polished and clean cut as the original series, Star Trek. Have you noticed that when watching the show?
I mean, not really, but yeah, I mean, but you can see it because like the way Hoshi was so timid in the first episode, you can kind of see how, you know, not everybody is that gung-ho about exploration and being there. And so what Berman says in this is that the people are not flawless human beings, like that this bridges the gap between our time and the time on, in the Next Gen, or even in TOS when the people were a little better. They got along better, and so here you're going to see more conflict among the characters. That was something the writers, starting with TNG and then all the way up, the writers always complained about how are they going to get conflict in with these characters that are such good friends. The crew of the Enterprise and the other shows were just so they were such good friends and so close. They didn't argue. They all got along.
And he even braced the viewers, saying that the characters are going to sometimes wear sneakers and jeans.
Yeah,
very different from yeah, very different though. You saw them in casual attire, even with ball caps on missions. Like, you never saw that in any other Star Trek series. So, I mean, that was by intent, bridging the gap of today's casualness with the futuristic gear of tomorrow.
I think the Enterprise uniforms kind of show that with their with the jumpsuit type. The ones from like on TNG, the uniforms look so formal.
Mm-hmm. And also, it asks about the species, about new species, and how are they going to work in new species, but never relating to them years later.
And that was interesting too. So he can mention the Suliban by name in this article. This was several months before the show came on, but he could already give away a few spoilers. But they didn't know that like what species the Doctor was at that time. They hadn't made up a name for his species yet. We know now that he's Denobulan.
And also, they straight up asked, the look of the Klingons has changed over time. How will you deal with that?
And he said they're just going to show the TNG Klingons.
Yeah, so they didn't say that we're going to explain it, we're going to develop it further on. They just said that's the one that everyone likes, that everyone's familiar with. They're going to take some liberties with certain things, such as the computer consoles, as well as the communicators, which I think at that time everyone had flip phones. You had to do something to bridge the gap with modern day technology, but still keep it within Trek lore.
It's very hard to measure, like, the way technology is now and what it's going to be like, as he said, 150 years from now, where Enterprise is set. And then you think about what the time 150 years after that when TOS is set. And we've already got some things more advanced now than they had on the original series. So it was very hard to make it all fall in, which again is why I was so leery of the idea of doing a Star Trek prequel in the first place. You know they're not going to be able to get the technology realistic to make it fit in with everything that's done and everything that we have now in the present.
And he asked about Scott Bakula. What was he going to bring onto the show? Which I thought this was great because Scott Bakula already had a huge fan following, and he was known in sci-fi world for being Sam Beckett.
And that was cool to have someone who already had a following that could bring, especially a sci-fi following, someone that could bring his own audience to this show and maybe get a lot of new sci-fi fans into it. And I do remember reading, like, even before this, about how they had offered the part to Scott Bakula and they were just waiting to hear his answer. And even back then I was thinking, oh yes, I hope he does it. Because that would be cool to have him, someone who's already known to do this.
Also brought up the issue of the sexiness of T'Pol and saying, do we really need another 7 of 9 on the show?
And this was funny too in this article where he says that T'Pol is not going to wear a cat suit. I mean, he said it there, but that obviously they changed their mind about that.
Yes. And I like how he said, look, Star Trek has had sexiness in it. 1991 in Star Trek VI: The Undiscovered Country, Kim Cattrall was pretty damn sexy.
And is that the best example he could come up with? I mean, Kirstie Alley was sexy too, I think.
Oh, absolutely.
And
Uhura, are you kidding me?
Right,
yeah.
And people on the original series.
All through it. I mean, that's one of the things that, as much as I loved Star Wars when I was younger, by the time I got into middle school, I was gearing much more towards Star Trek because it was growing up with me. And this article brings out that T'Pol is certainly going to be a sensual young woman. And there was sensuality in this show, so I liked it that there's a little bit more adult themes to this than they were able to do in previous Star Treks.
And really, I think the look that T'Pol had for the first 2 seasons was more tomboyish, really. I mean,
so reserved.
She had the feminine figure, but she was still, wearing the darker cat suit and everything. She just, even though when they showed her in the decontamination scenes, that one's when she got sexier.
That's what I was thinking of, totally. I think those are some of the most paused moments in Star Trek DVDs. I'm not kidding. Like those
the
scenes.
Decontamination scenes, the little rubbing the gel on each other. They were going to take their time doing that.
And it closes out with, word is that Enterprise is a much steamier, lustier Trek. Is that true?
Well, see, he gives the example that we just said when they're doing the scenes where they're rubbing the lotion on each other coming back from a trip. So, I mean, they threw that in, and every time I saw one of those scenes, I knew it. Of course, it's so obvious, so they're trying to make it sexier. Well, the uniforms are pretty tight anyway, yes, and especially T'Pol's, but they had to do that and show some skin. Mm-hmm. Okay, I mean, at least the show still had some substance.
And they had the guys, bouncing around in their underwear too.
They did.
You were happy about that.
The time that Captain Archer was in his shower and started floating,
Yeah. So, great prep and this came out in July, so fans were eagerly anticipating this new Star Trek series. But I think the best way to enjoy the series and to understand it more and to see the progression in a more sensible way is to not look at it as a prequel of Star Trek, the original series, but look at it as a sequel to our present day space program system. So look at it as something that we're going to look forward to 150 years from now. And when you look at it with that NASA background, that exploration feel to it, it makes way more sense.
They made the Enterprise uniforms an offshoot of the NASA spacesuits, the blue, and having them more like coveralls, in a jumpsuit that actually had pockets. So it does fit, and they even tried to make it look, the inside of the Enterprise was kind of the submarine look, but like the old Navy look, and also in some ways like the way we picture Enterprise or NASA shuttles to look.
Totally. You brought it up, NASA shuttle. All right, this intro to the show was unlike any other intro, because instead of showing the current ship in various formations, which we know that's how all the Star Trek episodes begin with their title sequence, this instead gave a history of man traveling. At first, it was by sea, and later it was by air. After that, it was going into space. So let's talk about the intro sequence, because that too was a radically different departure from other Star Trek series.
Showing all of these different pictures, and some of it familiar, some of it less familiar, but I mean, it was a beautiful progression, showing the old clipper ships and, all up through the space shuttle and then the space scenes.
Even starting with a raft. I'm so talking humble beginnings of man exploring beyond his own land. So we're talking naval at first. Not organized naval, but a raft. And then we go into the HMS Enterprise. Yes, that was a real ship, British fleet ship. Goes into a flying balloon, the Spirit of St. Louis. Now here's the Space Shuttle Enterprise. That is one of the ones that was amazing. Art imitating history, history imitating art. I mean, what'd you think about that in 1976 when the first space shuttle was called Enterprise?
Yeah, that was cool, and I think we've already talked about it on some other podcasts too. But I mean, the people voted on what to call the first space shuttle, and it was in the 70s. It was when Star Trek was growing in reruns, and everyone just said Enterprise, and I just thought that was so awesome. They had the Star Trek cast there too.
So that's one of the things to look for throughout the show is the HMS Enterprise, that clipper ship, as well as the space shuttle. And then it goes on to have the Amelia Earhart. We see a deep-sea diving submarine, because we're going to see elements of, as you mentioned, submarine feel to the Enterprise. So it made sense of them putting in an unknown territory being explored with this vessel. And then Chuck Yeager in his flight suit, the Apollo astronauts, Alan Shepard. So this is going into the space program now of the 60s, 70s, 80s, even more so with people on it. And we also see the first stage of the Saturn V separation, Buzz Aldrin on the moon. There's a ton of imagery there. And Z from Cockrum, his Phoenix flight. So this is a tie-in to Star Trek First Contact.
And that was great too. They did tie it into established canon.
Yes. So now we're seeing that the real world space program is narrowing its way into the Star Trek space program. And this is something that's really curious. You see the ship, and you had to do some digging to find out what it was. And I'm sure if there was a season 4, season 5, we would have seen elements of this ship, but it's an early warp starship. It's the SS Emmett. It's flying over an Earth colony. And then it goes into the NX-01 Enterprise. I don't know if anybody has a problem with the opening credits, but the controversial part of the opening credits is
the song.
It's a song that was taken from the end credits of Patch Adams. That's so bizarre.
And it was because the creators of the show actually liked that song in the movie. But really, when you watch it right at the beginning, the song fits because it says it's been a long time getting from there to here, and it's showing the past of Earth's space travel or travel. So it does fit.
The song does fit. The song does fit. It was just hard for us as Star Trek fans because we saw a certain continuity with the opening sequences, Next Generation, Deep Space Nine, Voyager. We were expecting something very similar, and this was radically different. They couldn't afford Rod Stewart, so they had another artist sing the song, Russell Watson. I actually like this version. It doesn't bother me that it's not Rod Stewart. I mean, I couldn't care less who sang it, but after a while, the song starts to grow on you.
I mean, the song was okay. And they did kind of jazz up the music in later seasons, and that helped. There
was an adjustment later on, and we're going to see that throughout the series. Right off the bat, this is not called Star Trek Enterprise. For the first 2 seasons, it's just called Enterprise. Didn't you think that was curious?
Yes, it's like they were trying to disguise it, like it's a Star Trek show, but we're just not going to say it, even though everyone knew it was, and we knew it was based on canon. But it was sort of an attempt to get new people to watch it.
I think that we've noticed that Star Trek consistently makes a desperate attempt to get new viewers. Instead of just building naturally on the fan base and having the viewers come to them, there seems to be a drive to let's reset everything, let's change everything so that we can create a new fan base. I'm not exactly thrilled with that at all. You don't have to hide the fact that it's Star Trek. As soon as you put a Vulcan on the show, people know it's Star Trek.
Right, and most people do know that the Enterprise is Star Trek's ship.
Alright, so let's talk about this opening episode, entitled
Broken Bow.
Originally aired September 26th, 2001, written by Rick Berman and Brandon Braga, directed by James L. Conway. We're greeted with a TNG-style Klingon. We already discussed the shock of seeing something like that, but the funny thing is this was a professional wrestler. He starred in the movie with Hulk Hogan, No Holds Barred. This was Zeus. They made him up so much, I didn't even know it was Zeus till years later.
They just needed a big, tall guy to play the Klingon.
We are introduced to the entire cast of characters, and I actually did like this opening episode because of how they introduced everyone. I can't remember now if I saw it in one complete part, if it was like a TV special event, or if I saw it in 2 parts. Do you recall?
I think that this first episode was aired as a 2-hour premiere.
I think so too, just like TNG. And then later in repeats, they split it up. Is that how it worked?
I don't know if they did.
So.
They might have. Yeah, when they reran this episode, I think they did split it up.
Just like they did for TNG and the other series.
Earth launches its first starship of exploration, Enterprise, on a mission to return an injured Klingon to his homeworld.
So I like this because we're seeing behind the scenes or a background of a captain right from the onset, why he got into a program such as this.
Well, it shows Captain Archer as a child with his father. And his father was instrumental in space exploration as well, because he was the engineer that designed the first Warp 5.
Which is fantastic. We've never had the background of any starship captain like this. We have had some references in books, novels, comics, but to have it on screen, I like the introduction, showing that Jonathan Archer pretty much was bred to be a starship captain.
And the fact that he was so excited from such a young age, and he had the model airplane that he could fly, or he was actually building it himself too. Mm-hmm. So yeah, to see the excitement in that child, and a lot of people related to that when they were watching it, I'm sure. I mean, it's like, yeah, that's the way I was, and that's the way my kids are.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so we have the introduction of Jonathan Archer, but sci-fi fans know him from
Quantum Leap.
And that threw me off. Big time. We want to talk about people being typecast. I looked at him as Sam Beckett. And it was so hard for me to see Sam Beckett in a Star Trek show.
Well, I mean, for me, I didn't watch Quantum Leap as much, but I liked Scott Bakula from He was on Murphy Brown. I remember him on that show.
Okay.
Yeah, but I mean, I liked him, and I was glad he was on this show, just because it would bring more people to the show, because he did have a lot of fans. So, I mean, yeah, I thought it was great seeing him on this as Archer.
Again, at the time, it was hard for me, but now I love him. I think he's a fantastic captain. We're introduced to a Vulcan on the show. They had to put a Vulcan in because everyone loves Vulcans, and pretty much, they skipped over Vulcans purposely in the Next Generation because they wanted TNG to stand on its own 2 feet. By this point, they want Star Trek to appeal to the masses as much as possible. So he brought in a Vulcan, but actually this made a ton of sense because they tied it in to the First Contact movie, and we're going to see it on multiple levels throughout the series this happens. What did you think about Jolene Blaylock and her character?
I mean, she was so adversarial in this one, just like all the Vulcans were. I mean, I liked her better later on. But the way that the Vulcans were opposed to the humans going into space, and even on this episode, the way Archer had to fight with them so much to let him go, that's just, that's a little jarring because I always liked the Vulcans. I mean, they're my favorites.
Mm-hmm.
But I mean, I was glad when I heard that they were going to have a Vulcan as a regular on the show.
Yes. And T'Pol, her character, had a very unique position because she wasn't going to be a member of the crew, but she was going to be a sort of a liaison. She was there to observe. What did you think about her role?
Yeah, her role was okay. I think it was necessary, right? She was also the science officer, which they needed. And she had access to the Vulcan database. I mean, it was there on the computer, but she was familiar with it, right?
It totally made sense.
Because Vulcans had already explored a lot of space, and so they relied on that Vulcan database in a lot of episodes.
Yes.
So I mean, yes, it made sense to have someone like her who was more familiar with space than the humans were. And she was added there just to, in some ways she was supposed to be the, less agreeable person, the one who would always bring up in any, fallibilities or anything like that in the humans.
And to a degree, I'm seeing kind of sort of that reference from the original series, the trilogy of Kirk, Spock, and McCoy. I'm seeing that numerous times with Captain Archer, T'Pol, and Dr. Phlox.
Okay. Yeah, Dr. Phlox was a different type of character, too.
He was super open-minded. Another alien species that we're exposed to, and
Denobulan.
So the Denoblians. Throughout the series, we're going to find out more about this alien race, and he's so accepting because his race is so different, and he's constantly saying, "Well, you have to be more open-minded. You have to realize everyone's not like you." I mean, he's the most Star Trek character of all Star Trek characters in this show. He's kind of like the voice of reason in so many episodes.
Now, first of all, I do like that he was like a new race. I mean, it's good that they tried to introduce new races on this show. And Dr. Phlox was so different because he was so even-tempered. Yeah, kind of the opposite of T'Pol. I mean, because he just sort of went along with everything.
Mm-hmm.
And he also had such different methods as a doctor. I mean, they were making this a prequel, so it was in Star Trek's past, but then he's almost like the past of us in some ways, using something like leeches. I mean, the way he used animals so much in his medicine was really different. And I mean,
his medical bay was unique.
Yeah,
it
made him seem even more primitive than we are in some cases. But of course, he had the advanced technology, the sensors and everything. But yeah, he became an interesting character later. At first, you're like, I mean, just to be so laid back. And he wasn't argumentative, but he also wasn't, I don't know, he didn't seem that excitable, even though he was happy, but he was, not really as emotional as some people either.
For the first time ever on a Star Trek TV series, we have someone that whole job is handling weapons and security. Dominic Keating as Lieutenant Malcolm Reed. What'd you think about his role?
Well, having someone in charge of security And that's funny because like on the original series, you know, they didn't have a continuing character in security, but they started that with with TNG Forward.
Well, his was more than just security.
Yeah, he was weapons, yes.
So they were kind of combining everything.
Right.
We're reminded of that. It's a quarter of the size of the original Enterprise. So they have to do multiple roles. Everyone has to be able to be a multitasker.
Yeah, that's true. And but it made sense combining weapons and security because I mean, yeah, if he was in charge of security, he would probably be a weapons expert. So that was fitting, and the fact that he had a station on the bridge, I mean, that all was good. What the thing about Reed though is because when you're watching this first episode, you don't really see as much of him. You don't really know that much about him except his name, position, and that he's British, and that's about it.
That's right. Anthony Montgomery as Ensign Travis Mayweather. He was raised not on a planet, but in outer space. Now, I think this is going to be one of the characters that there should be multiple people like him in Star Trek going forward. Because when you have these colonies and ports, everything dealing with space exploration, it just makes sense that there are going to be kids born on that have never laid foot on their home planet, or at least for an extended period of time. So I think he's a very interesting character with regards to his background.
And, you know, if he was born on, it was like a freighter ship, it makes you wonder, how long have they actually been traveling in space? And then I think they said this was about 90 years since the time of Zefram Cochrane in First Contact.
Yes.
So they've had plenty of time to be in space, even though they're, you know, there's the excitement that Enterprise is the first ship of its kind at this time. But it's the first Warp 5. It doesn't mean it's the first faster than light ship. And it doesn't mean it's the first time they've actually traveled into space.
That's right.
I mean, you kind of thought that it would be about the first time in space, but it's not really. It's just sort of, it's just one of the first times. Mm-hmm. But Mayweather, and again, you don't really know as much about him, but it was neat to see, like, when he found the sweet spot on the ship. That was a cool scene. I love that part. Yeah, yeah.
Well, I think it showed that he, even though he was an ensign, he still had life lessons that he could share with the other crew. I think he's the only ensign that I've ever seen on a Star Trek series that could claim that my life lessons are so valuable even though I don't have a high rank.
He actually had more experience in space than the rest of the crew. That's
He's been to more
neat.
planets than anyone else on the crew.
Yes.
I mean, it's just a neat character. I like him a lot. Linda Park is Ensign Hoshi Sato. I love her introduction in the show. And that's one of the things throughout the show, I think the introduction to the characters was marvelous. What'd you think about seeing her and her roots of being a linguistics expert?
That was good too. It shows that so they didn't really have the same type of working universal translator that we know now in Star Trek. Back then it was they had something, but it was less developed, and they still needed someone who was a linguistics expert. And it was nice that they showed Hoshi how she had a job on Earth, and she wanted to finish that before she went into space. But then Archer was able to entice her with the recordings of the Klingon language, the Klingon speaking, and she was like, well, you know, that's what changed her mind, that she would just go ahead and leave her job and go ahead and serve on Enterprise. So that's how excited she was to learn new languages. And so she had a passion for her job, her specialty.
And I do like the fact that it reinforces that if you're a communications officer, you have to know how to communicate on so many different levels. And throughout the series, we're going to see her do this even more so.
Right. It's not just you just use the universal translator for everything. At this time, they didn't know as many languages. And, you know, the other thing we talked about was the fact that she had blue, like she was a blue sciences. She was in that department. But Uhura in communications wore the red uniform.
Yes. We know that department colors have changed throughout the years. We know there was a big jump with the motion picture, and then Wrath of Khan.
Yes.
And then they went back to being more streamlined with The Next Generation.
Yes, but even with the red, yellow, and blue colors, Captain went from yellow in TOS to red in TNG.
Yes.
So even that changed.
Yes. And so we're assuming that blue during this time period was called, linguistic sciences, communication sciences? It had to be some branch of the science form. So it's interesting to see how Starfleet early on, how they viewed different departments. And Connor Trenier as Commander Charles Trip Tucker III. I'll tell you, I hated this guy right off the bat.
He was argumentative at first. And he was the one that stood up for humans against the Vulcans because he was always arguing with T'Pol. And, T'Pol was putting humans down and he would put Vulcans down just as much.
I thought he was too crash. He was too rude. I just didn't like him early on. He softened up later on, but I'd like to think that over 100 years from now, people would be kinder and gentler and be more sympathetic, be more understanding and open. And this guy was he just wouldn't quit sometimes. I thought he was annoying, but it was a good contrast character.
It was at the beginning, and even if he wasn't more accepting, I mean, you think about the way McCoy was and the way Dr. McCoy also seemed racist against Spock a lot of times. And the fact that they made Trip a Southerner like McCoy, I mean, I kind of saw a parallel there. Trip and Archer are supposed to be best friends on this. And in some ways it's like Kirk McCoy, the captain the Southerner.
Yes. Now, we have a couple reoccurring characters that are introduced in this episode that we're seeing an awful lot, one being Vaughn Armstrong as Admiral Maxwell Forrest. I thought that was great casting. I think he handled his job well. Yes,
and this is, he's been on Star Trek before, but this is the first time he played a human, so you can now we can recognize him when we see him at a con.
Mm-hmm. And Gary Graham as Ambassador Soval.
Yes, and he had also been on Star Trek before, but and of course he's well known for being on Alien Nation.
That's where I knew him from. So when I watched this show initially, I was like, this is like Quantum Leap meets Alien Nation.
But I was always a fan of Gary Graham. So
and he's a great guy too, meeting him at cons.
It's great seeing him on this.
Mm-hmm. And I love the fact that the Axanar fan film series, they actually hired him to be in the Axanar Prelude video production to reprise his role as Soval. So even on the fan level of independent Star Trek films, he's involved there. Yeah,
that was cool. But even so, now that we've gone through the main characters, it still seems like Reed. Well, I guess it was Reed mostly. Did he just seem kind of bland in this one?
He did.
And even when I remember watching this for the first time and thinking that Reed and Trip, somehow their characters seemed to go together. Like there wasn't enough distinction in like their jobs because they were both engineering types. I mean, because Reed worked with weapons, and that was an engineering thing about how the weapons worked within the ship. And so
which totally made sense.
Yeah, so those characters were they kind of blended together to me. And in the beginning.
And I like the fact, because we look at TOS, red shirts were security. I think this gives us an understanding and an explanation of, okay, if Starfleet started out having weapons and security together, working with engineering, all right, they're all red. They're all connected. That's why years later in TOS, it made sense. They all had red.
Yeah, the fact that they were the same color for some reason, it almost seems like they really should have had more than just the three colors, the way Orville does.
But I like it because throughout watching the show, we kept saying, how does this tie into TOS? How does this tie into TOS? And so we are seeing, I'd say a good amount of time, they do a great job with it. They flub up sometimes, but overall they do a really good job of it. All right, the premise of this, a Klingon, right? Humans are seeing a Klingon for the first time, and they're freaking out.
Yeah, and the thing is, Klingons are not really depicted as the villain in this episode. Even though, I mean, the Vulcans, like, they're familiar with Klingons, but they don't even act like they're not really enemies of the Klingons. It's not like, what are the Klingons of this time? Like, are they really that aggressive? And we do see that they are, but they're just not, they haven't really made themselves enemies of the humans and Vulcans yet.
I got the impression that they weren't into the conquering mode yet, like we would see in TOS.
Which is very strange. Yeah, that's different. But the thing is, because Klingons are so embedded in our minds, we already have that idea about them when we see them.
We're also introduced to the Suliban in this episode. The Suliban were this new species were in pursuit of the Klingons. I mean, the effects were great.
Yeah, the Suliban that are able to shapeshift and make themselves flat so they can go under doors. But then we also find out that not all of them are like that, because it's just that the ones that are part of what they mentioned, the Cabal, they've been through some kind of genetic engineering, so that's why they can do that. But it was an interesting new race. And then the fact that they mentioned the temporal Cold War, and that's a new facet that they will talk about all through Enterprise.
And it's funny because when I first watched the show, that went straight over my head. Again, this show gets better during a rewatch. When you rewatch it, you're like, oh, they were planting seeds all along. And
because now you can, anything you don't understand, you can look up on Memory Alpha.
Yeah, and years ago, you watch it and that's it, unless you videotaped it. But now everything you could just binge it. So it's easier to see the connections now than when I did 20-something years ago.
And this episode it introduced a lot of things because of having the Suliban and having the temporal Cold War and having the faceless guy, the future guy. So it brought out this stuff that that they're going to address in future episodes, even though some of it was never really resolved. So on first watch though, it all seems very strange, and it's all like, and the thing is, I don't even think I found it that interesting to begin with. I was like, okay, so that's what they're going to do. I mean, with all the stuff that they're going to address later, it didn't really look exciting enough to even want to know more about it later. But I mean, I still kept watching because it was Star Trek, and I did want to see what was going to happen. So it's like watching it the first time. It doesn't really grab you as much. I think the other pilot episodes were better.
I think this pilot episode was a struggle as far as the plot, but I love the fact how they introduced everyone. They got the introductions done wonderfully. And so that's what I view as the highlight is, okay, going forward, I pretty much know who everyone is. Not all Star Trek series are like that, especially the Discoverse ones, the modern ones. Who are these people? We'll watch it 3 years, don't know who they are, don't know anything about them. So I mean, to the credit of this episode, we have a firm foundation of the characters. And
throughout the series, they tried to make it an ensemble cast where they would have episodes that focus on different people. Another thing was that, of course, since it's a prequel, they were supposed to have less technology. So the universal translator was different back then. Also, did you notice the transporter? Like they have the transporter, but no one is really comfortable with it yet.
Makes sense.
Yeah, because even in the 23rd and 24th centuries, you had people who still weren't comfortable with it, even when it became commonplace.
And did you notice in this episode, there were 3 prominent Starfleet officers? It's Admiral Forrest, Admiral Leonard, and Commander Williams. They were homages to DeForest Kelly, Leonard Nimoy, and William Shatner. And then one of the Vulcans from the High Command is called TOS, which is a reference to the original series.
That was neat that they did that. Yeah, I love how they throw these little things in, too, for the fans.
Another thing that I think they did a wonderful job with is putting Zefram Cochrane in this episode. And it's the same actor that was in a lot of references to First Contact.
Yeah, it's great that they can get the same actors for that continuity. Even though sometimes they've changed actors for some parts, but when they can get the same actor, it's always great.
I love his speech when he said, "Let us go boldly where no man has gone before." So that set up the whole Star Trek series. It's almost crediting Zefram Cochrane to that phrase.
And this show was also like Voyager. It was supposed to be the headlining show for a new network.
Okay, Star Trek has been trying to do that for how many years? Since the 70s?
Yeah, since they did that Star Trek Phase 2, proposed show that they were going to make in the 70s.
Mm-hmm. And the Suliban, we were talking about the Suliban. Rick Berman said that they were named after the Taliban. And look at how timely this was, right after September 11th.
Yes, that is what they were named after.
And we don't want to forget about Porthos.
Captain Archer's dog.
He was a beagle. Everyone loves Porthos.
Yeah, he became one of the more popular characters on this show, too. I thought that the plot was a little... It introduced too much. It had too much going on for a pilot episode. And, of course, I mean, it was too...
I thought the plot was convoluted.
Yeah.
I really didn't like the storyline at all.
I mean, being 2 hours long, yeah, they can do a lot with that, but it's still... it was just... It just seemed like it was too many events strung along.
Too much jumping around.
And, they've got the Klingon on the Enterprise, and then the Klingon gets kidnapped, and then they have to go to the other planet to find the Suliban woman, and then they go to Kronos. Yeah, it seemed like too many events strung along, didn't it? So
much so. That's why when we walk away from it, we both said, I don't think the story was that great, but introducing us to the characters so that moving forward, we could enjoy the show more. I think that's what made, that was the best part about it.
There were a lot of fight scenes in it, and that is one thing that Scott Bakula said, that this was a very physical episode. I mean, even more than some of the ones that came after it.
Yeah.
So yeah, they had to get the action in.
Yeah. So overall, thumbs up or thumbs down for this episode?
Yeah, it's hard to say. I guess I'm kind of middle with this one.
I am too. That's my stand. Is I'm gonna give it a thumbs up because I love the characters. I love the introduction of the characters. I love the fact I can move forward knowing who everyone is. So that I'm gonna give it a thumbs up. Storyline, I'm gonna have to give it a thumbs down. I didn't feel the storyline was engaging enough for me.
Yeah, that's the way I see it too. The characters were pretty good, except maybe for Reed was the least character in this episode. But the whole plot could have been better. Thanks for listening. Make sure you hit that subscribe button and join our Facebook group. Live long, and may the Force be with you. Nanu Nanu.